It's been 5 years since I signed the agreement. 5 years of silence, 5 years of pretending nothing happened. But now that the contract has expired, I can finally tell the truth. Not that anyone will believe me. They'll call me crazy, a conspiracy theorist, or worse. But I don't care. This story needs to be told, even if it's just to an anonymous void online. It started on a cold October night in Montana. The kind of night where the air feels sharp, like it could cut you if you breathed too deeply. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital, the kind of shift that leaves your bones aching and your mind numb. The highway was empty, just me and the endless road under a sky so dark it felt like a void. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had rolled in, thick and unnatural, like it didn't belong. Then the radio cut out. One moment, I was listening to some old rock song, the kind that makes you tap your fingers on the steering wheel without thinking. The next, there was nothing but static. I fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same: silence, then a faint hiss, like the sound of air escaping from a tire. I was about to turn it off when a voice broke through. "Emergency alert. This is not a test. A geological event has been reported in your area. Please remain calm. Turn off all air conditioning systems. Slow down and divert to the nearest exit. Repeat. This is not a test." The voice was robotic and monotone, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. A geological event? In Montana? I'd lived here my whole life, and the most exciting thing that ever happened was the occasional snowstorm. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. Just a blank screen with the words, "No service," staring back at me. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the road ahead. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the wheel. The highway was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. It was like the world had been emptied out, leaving only me and this strange, creeping mist. Then I saw the lights. Up ahead, flashing red and blue. Police cars, their lights cutting through the fog like beacons. As I got closer, I could see officers in full riot gear, their faces obscured by gas masks. They were blocking the road, waving drivers toward an exit I'd never noticed before. I rolled down my window as one of them approached. "Stay in your vehicle," he barked, his voice muffled by the mask. "Turn off your engine and wait for further instructions." "What's going on?" I asked, but he was already moving to the next car. I did as I was told, pulling off the highway and into a large open field that had been turned into a makeshift parking lot. Dozens of cars were already there, parked in neat rows, their headlights cutting through the fog like ghostly eyes. I turned off the engine and sat there, my heart pounding. The radio was still repeating the same message over and over. "Geological event. Turn off the air conditioning. Slow down. Divert to the nearest exit." I looked around. The other drivers seemed just as confused as I was. Some were on their phones, others were leaning out of their windows, shouting questions at the officers. But the cops weren't answering. They just stood there, silent and unmoving like statues. Then the ground shook. It wasn't like an earthquake. It was slower, deeper, like the earth itself was groaning. The cars around me rattled, and I heard the sound of glass breaking somewhere in the distance. The officers didn't react. They just stood there, their masks reflecting the flashing lights. "What the hell is going on?" someone shouted, but there was no answer. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a moment, everything was still. Then the officers started moving, herding us further into the field. They were setting up barricades blocking off the exits. I felt a chill run down my spine. We weren't being protected. We were being trapped. I rolled up my window and locked the doors. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The officers moved with military precision, their boots crunching on the gravel as they sealed off the field. More cars were being directed in, their headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights. I counted at least 50 vehicles now, maybe more. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath come in short, shallow bursts. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. The radio was still playing that same automated message, but now there was something else. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound like static, but more deliberate. It was coming from outside, somewhere in the fog. I strained to listen, but it was hard to pinpoint. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The officers started handing out supplies, bottles of water, energy bars, and thick black plastic bags. One of them approached my car, his mask reflecting the dim light. He placed a bottle of water and a bag on my hood, then rapped on my window with his gloved hand. "Stay in your vehicle," he said, his voice muffled but firm. "Do not open your doors or windows unless absolutely necessary. If you need to relieve yourself, use the bag. Seal it and drop it outside. Do not leave your vehicle under any circumstances." I nodded, though he couldn't see me through the tinted glass. He moved on to the next car, repeating the same instructions. I picked up the water bottle and twisted the cap off, taking a small sip. It tasted metallic, like it had been sitting in a warehouse for years. The clicking sound grew louder. I peered out the window, trying to see through the fog. The other drivers were doing the same, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. Some were whispering to each other, their voices barely audible over the hum of idling engines. Others were silent, their eyes darting around like they were waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it. A shadow moved in the fog, just beyond the barricades. It was tall, too tall to be human, and it moved with a strange, jerky gait. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped into the light. It was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, like it had been stretched out and twisted into something unnatural. Its skin, if you could call it that, was smooth and black, reflecting the light like oil. And its face, God, its face. It had no eyes, just a gaping hole where its mouth should have been, lined with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I froze, my hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The creature tilted its head as if it could sense me watching. Then it let out a sound, a low, guttural click that sent a shiver down my spine. The officers didn't react. They just stood there, their weapons at their sides, like they didn't even see it. The creature moved closer, its long, clawed fingers brushing against the hood of a nearby car. The driver screamed, slamming on the horn, but the creature didn't flinch. It leaned down, its face inches from the windscreen, and let out another click. Then it straightened up and moved on, disappearing back into the fog. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. What the hell was that thing, and why weren't the officers doing anything about it? The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from all around us now, like we were surrounded. I glanced at the other drivers. Some were crying, others were praying, but most were just staring straight ahead, their faces blank with fear. Then the officers started moving again. They were setting up some kind of machine at the edge of the field, a large, boxy thing with a nozzle on the front. One of them connected a hose to it, then turned a valve. A thick white mist began to pour out, spreading across the ground like a living thing. "Remain calm," one of the officers said over a loudspeaker. "This is a precautionary measure. The mist is non-toxic and will help contain the situation. Stay in your vehicles and do not attempt to leave the area." The mist rolled toward us, swallowing the cars one by one. I rolled up my window as it reached my car, but it seeped in through the vents, filling the interior with a sharp, chemical smell. My eyes watered, and I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve. The mist was thick, almost opaque, and it made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. The clicking sound was muffled now, but it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of the mist. I could feel it, like a presence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but all I could see was that creature's face, those jagged teeth, that gaping hole where its mouth should have been. Then the screaming started. It was faint at first, just a single voice, high-pitched and desperate. Then more joined in, a chorus of terror that echoed through the mist. I couldn't see what was happening, but I could hear it. The sound of glass breaking, metal screeching, and that awful guttural clicking. I curled up in my seat, my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The screams grew louder, more frantic, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the world itself is holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for something to happen. The mist was so thick now that I couldn't even see the car next to me. The only sound was the faint hum of the machine, still pumping out that white fog. Then I heard it, a tap on my window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tap came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural click. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. And there it was. The creature's face pressed against the glass, its jagged teeth bared in what might have been a smile. It tilted its head, staring at me with that empty, gaping hole where its eyes should have been. Then it raised one long, clawed finger and tapped on the glass again. The creature's finger tapped against the glass, each click sending a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its face was so close I could see the texture of its skin, smooth and oily, like it was made of liquid darkness. It tilted its head again, as if studying me, and then it opened its mouth. A sound came out, but it wasn't a click this time. It was a low, guttural growl, like the rumble of an engine mixed with the hiss of escaping air. The glass fogged up where its breath hit it, and I could see the faint outline of its teeth pressing against the window. It was testing the barrier, probing for weakness. I reached for the door lock, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grip the handle. The creature's growl grew louder, more insistent, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. I had to do something, but what? The mist outside was too thick to see through, and the officers were nowhere to be found. I was on my own. Then I remembered the bag the officer had given me. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling with the plastic. Inside was a small rectangular device, a flare. I didn't know why they'd given it to me, but I wasn't about to question it. I pulled the cap off and struck the end, the flare igniting with a bright, hissing light. The creature recoiled, its growl turning into a high-pitched screech. It stumbled back, its long limbs flailing as it tried to shield itself from the light. I held the flare up to the window, the bright red glow cutting through the mist like a beacon. The creature hissed again, then turned and disappeared into the fog. I didn't waste any time. I shoved the flare into the cup holder and started the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, backing out of the parking space. The mist swirled around me, thick and impenetrable, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I drove blindly, the headlights barely piercing the fog. The other cars were still parked in neat rows, their drivers either too scared to move or already gone. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest as I navigated the maze of vehicles. Then I hit something. It wasn't a car. It was too soft for that. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the gravel. The mist swirled around me, obscuring whatever I'd hit. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. I looked out the window, but the mist was too thick to see anything. Then something slammed into the side of the car, the impact so hard it rocked the vehicle on its wheels. I screamed, slamming the gas pedal down, but the wheels just spun in the gravel. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the car shaking as whatever was out there clawed at the door. I grabbed the flare again, holding it up to the window. The light cut through the mist, revealing the creature's face pressed against the glass. Its mouth was open, those jagged teeth glinting in the red light. It hissed, its breath fogging up the window, and then it lunged. The glass shattered, shards raining down on me as the creature's long, clawed fingers reached inside. I swung the flare at it, the bright light forcing it back, but it wasn't enough. It was too strong, too fast. I could feel its claws scraping against my arm, drawing blood, and I knew I was running out of time. Then I remembered the machine. The officers had set it up at the edge of the field, pumping out that thick white mist. If I could get to it, maybe I could use it to fight back. I didn't know how, but it was the only chance I had. I slammed the car into gear and hit the gas, the tires spinning in the gravel before finally catching. The creature screeched, its claws scraping against the roof as I sped away. I didn't look back. I just drove, the mist swirling around me like a living thing. The machine came into view, its nozzle still pumping out that thick white mist. I skidded to a stop, the car sliding sideways as I jumped out. The flare was still in my hand, its bright light cutting through the fog. I ran toward the machine, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was right behind me. I could hear its growl and feel its breath on the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet slipping on the gravel as I reached the machine. I grabbed the hose, the metal cold against my skin, and turned the valve as far as it would go. The mist poured out, thicker and faster than before. It engulfed the creature, its growl turning into a high-pitched screech as it stumbled back. I held the flare up, the bright light cutting through the mist, and watched as the creature writhed and twisted, its oily skin bubbling and peeling away. It let out one final guttural growl, then collapsed into a heap on the ground. I stood there, my chest heaving, the flare still in my hand. The mist swirled around me, thick and impenetrable, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Then I heard it. Click, click, click. The clicking sound wasn't coming from just one direction anymore. It was everywhere. Behind me, in front of me, to the sides. The mist swirled and shifted, and I could see shadows moving within it, tall and thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. There wasn't just one creature. There was a swarm of them. I backed away from the machine, the flare still clutched in my hand. The mist was so thick now that I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could hear them, their clicking, their guttural growls, the sound of their claws scraping against the gravel. They were closing in. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the wet ground. The flare's light cut through the mist, but it wasn't enough to see where I was going. I stumbled over something, a body maybe, and nearly fell, but I caught myself and kept moving. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. The clicking grew louder, more insistent. I could feel them behind me, their presence pressing down on me like a weight. I glanced over my shoulder and saw one of them emerge from the mist, its long, clawed fingers reaching for me. I swung the flare at it, the bright light forcing it back. But another one took its place, then another, and another. I was surrounded. I backed up until I hit something solid, a car, maybe, or one of the barricades. I didn't have time to check. The creatures were closing in, their clicking growing louder, more frenzied. I held the flare out in front of me, the light flickering as the battery began to die. It wouldn't last much longer. Then I heard a voice.
Over here.
It was faint, barely audible over the clicking and growling, but it was there. I turned toward the sound, squinting through the mist. A figure was waving at me, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. The creatures followed, their clicking growing louder as they closed the distance. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, their claws scraping against the ground as they lunged for me. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I reached the figure. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into a small makeshift shelter, a tent, maybe, or a tarp stretched over a frame. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the mist out.
Stay down.
She whispered, her voice trembling.
They can't see us in here.
I crouched beside her, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The clicking was still there, just outside the shelter, but it was quieter now, more distant. The creatures were still searching, but they hadn't found us yet. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
My name's Sarah.
She said.
I was in one of the cars when this started. I managed to get out before they got everyone else.
I nodded, my mind racing. "Do you know what's going on? What are those things?" She shook her head.
No one knows? They just showed up after the emergency alert. The officers tried to contain them, but it didn't work.
I glanced around the shelter. It was small, barely big enough for the two of us, but it was better than nothing. There were a few supplies scattered around, a flashlight, some water bottles, a first aid kit. Sarah must have been here for a while. "We can't stay here," I said. "We need to find a way out."
I know. But the mist, it's everywhere. And those things, they're everywhere too.
I didn't have an answer for that. The mist was too thick to see through, and the creatures were too fast, too strong. We were trapped, just like everyone else. Then I heard it, a low rumbling sound, like the growl of an engine. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. I peered out of the shelter, squinting through the mist. The sound was coming from the highway, just beyond the barricades.
What is that?
Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I just watched as the mist began to shift, swirling and parting as something moved through it. The rumbling grew louder, and then I saw it. A large, armored vehicle, its headlights cutting through the fog like knives. The creatures turned toward it, their clicking growing louder, more frenzied. They lunged at the vehicle, their claws scraping against the metal, but it didn't stop. It plowed through them, its engine roaring as it pushed forward.
It's the military,
Sarah said, her voice filled with hope.
They've come to save us.
I didn't share her optimism. The vehicle wasn't stopping for anyone. It was moving too fast, too purposefully, like it had somewhere to be. And then I saw why. Behind it, the mist was clearing, revealing a line of soldiers in full combat gear. They were moving in formation, their weapons raised, their faces obscured by gas masks. They weren't here to save us. They were here to clean up. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice urgent. "Now." Sarah nodded, her face pale with fear. We crawled out of the shelter, the mist swirling around us as we moved. The soldiers were getting closer, their weapons firing in short, controlled bursts. The creatures screeched and hissed, their bodies falling to the ground as the bullets tore through them. But there were too many of them. The clicking grew louder, more frenzied, as the creatures swarmed the soldiers. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the highway, the mist parting as we ran. The armored vehicle was still moving, its headlights cutting through the fog like a beacon. If we could reach it, maybe we had a chance. But the creatures were everywhere. They lunged at us, their claws scraping against the ground as they closed the distance. I swung the flare at them, the bright light forcing them back, but it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and the flare was dying. Then I saw it, a gap in the barricades, just big enough for us to slip through. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward it, the creatures hot on our heels. We stumbled through the gap, the mist thinning as we reached the highway. The armored vehicle was just ahead, its engine roaring as it sped away. We weren't going to make it. The creatures were right behind us, their clicking growing louder, more frenzied. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, their claws scraping against the ground as they lunged for us. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I reached the edge of the highway. And then I saw it. A helicopter, its rotors spinning, its lights cutting through the mist. It was hovering just above the ground, its doors open. A soldier was standing in the doorway, his hand outstretched. "Jump!" he shouted. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the helicopter, the creatures right behind us. We jumped, our hands reaching for the soldiers as the helicopter lifted off the ground. The creatures lunged, their claws scraping against the metal, but they couldn't reach us. We were safe. For now. The helicopter climbed higher, the mist and the creatures shrinking below us until they were nothing more than a blur. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Sarah sat beside me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with shock. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what we'd just been through. The soldier who'd pulled us in didn't say much either. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with a grim expression that didn't match his age. He handed us blankets and bottles of water, then moved to the front of the helicopter to speak with the pilot. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their voices were low and urgent. I looked out the window. The landscape below was a patchwork of mist and shadows. The highway was gone, swallowed by the fog, and the field where we'd been trapped was just a dark smudge in the distance. I could still hear the clicking in my mind, that awful, guttural sound that had haunted me for hours. It was like it had burrowed into my brain, a constant reminder of what we'd escaped.
Where are they taking us?
Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I don't know. Somewhere safe, I hope. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The soldiers hadn't been there to save us. They'd been there to contain the situation, to clean up the mess. And now that we'd seen too much, I didn't know what they'd do with us. The helicopter flew for what felt like hours, the landscape below shifting from fields to forests to mountains. The mist thinned as we left the area, but the tension in the air didn't. The soldier kept glancing back at us, his expression unreadable behind his gas mask. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but I didn't dare. Something about the way he carried himself, cold, detached, almost robotic, made me keep my mouth shut. Finally, the helicopter began to descend. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest and towering mountains. A small, military-style compound came into view, its lights cutting through the darkness. The helicopter landed on a pad near the center of the compound, and the soldier motioned for us to get out. "Follow me," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. We did as we were told, stepping out of the helicopter and into the cold night air. The compound was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of generators and the distant clang of metal. The soldier led us to a small building near the edge of the compound, its windows dark and its door reinforced with steel. Inside, the air was stale and cold, like it hadn't been used in years. The soldier motioned for us to sit at a table in the center of the room, then left without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, and I heard the sound of a lock engaging.
What is this place?
Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, my eyes scanning the room. It was bare, except for the table and a few chairs. There were no windows, no decorations, nothing to indicate what this place was or why we were here. Then the door opened again, and a man walked in. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and a stern expression. He was dressed in a military uniform, but there were no insignias or badges to indicate his rank. He carried a folder under one arm, its contents hidden from view.
My name is Colonel Harris.
He said, his voice calm but authoritative.
I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
You could say that, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. What the hell is going on? What were those things? And why are we here? Colonel Harris didn't answer right away. He sat down at the table, placing the folder in front of him. He opened it, revealing a stack of documents and photographs. The top photo was of one of the creatures, its oily skin and jagged teeth captured in stark detail.
What you encountered tonight is classified.
He said, his voice calm but firm.
What you saw, what you heard, what you experienced, none of it leaves this room. Do you understand?
I glanced at Sarah, then back at the colonel. You can't just expect us to forget what happened. People died out there. Those things, they're still out there.
They've been contained,
he said, his tone leaving no room for argument.
The situation is under control.
Contained?
Sarah asked, her voice rising.
You call that contained? Those things were everywhere. They killed people.
Enough,
Colonel Harris said, cutting her off. His voice was sharp now, his patience clearly wearing thin.
You don't understand the gravity of the situation. What you saw tonight is just the tip of the iceberg. If this information gets out, it could cause widespread panic. It could destabilize entire governments. Do you understand what's at stake?
I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process everything he was saying. The creatures, the mist, the emergency alert. It was all part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Colonel Harris leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine.
You have two choices. You can sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk out of here with your lives, or you can refuse and we'll take other measures.
The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. I glanced at Sarah, her face pale with fear. We didn't have a choice. Not really. We'll sign, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Harris nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He slid a document across the table, along with a pen. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I scanned the text. It was standard legal jargon, but the implications were clear. If we talked, we'd be prosecuted, or worse. I signed my name, then handed the pen to Sarah. She hesitated for a moment, then signed as well. Colonel Harris took the document, his smile widening.
Good choice,
he said, standing up.
You'll be escorted out shortly. Remember, this never happened.
He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, my mind reeling. The creatures, the mist, the emergency alert. It was all real. And now, we were part of the cover-up. A few minutes later, the soldier returned and led us out of the building. The helicopter was waiting, its rotors spinning. We climbed in, the soldier taking his place beside the pilot. The helicopter lifted off, the compound shrinking below us until it was just a speck in the distance. I looked out the window, the landscape below a blur of trees and mountains. The mist was gone, replaced by the clear, cold night air. But the clicking was still there, echoing in my mind like a ghost. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd never forget what happened that night. And no matter how hard they tried to silence us, the truth was still out there, waiting